Thank you. And I think the next subject that I've had a number of questions on is car parking and ratios and why we believe the level of car parking being offered is appropriate for this location. So is that Richard? Is that for you to respond to on that one? I think you're always the most popular person on consultations when it comes to car parking. Is the parking expert. I've no doubt that will not be any different, or maybe the architecture team tomorrow on heights. But I think parking will be a close second in terms of just by the number of questions we've had on this issue tonight. So
always busy.
Always busy.
Yes,
So,
that's right.
But in all seriousness, a number of people have, in all seriousness, asked concerned questions. I mean, if this is Hertfordshire, people have cars. This isn't London. Why do we feel this level of parking is appropriate for this location?
Quite right. So obviously the site benefits from an extant planning permission with a level of parking that was agreed with the Borough Council, but also with Hertfordshire County Council as a local highway authority. So we have a consent with a parking strategy, and that parking strategy from the outset has been for low car development, and the low car development is supported, as you've heard already this evening, by improvements in infrastructure for pedestrians and cyclists and links to public transport as well. Importantly, there's reference you'll have heard a number of times to the car club, and a car club in a location like this is critical to the low car principle, because it means that every resident has access to a vehicle as and when they need one. So I think some of the concerns that have been raised about low levels of car parking can't be confused with low levels of availability of cars and vehicle ownership. It's reducing vehicle ownership while still allowing people access to cars through the car club, which is tried and tested. So we've spoken to a number of car club operators who have car clubs outside London, which is important, and we've taken their advice on the level of car club uptake that they would expect here, and the right number of vehicles to be provided for a scheme of this scale and type. And all of the data says that actually each car club vehicle will take between 10 and 20 cars off the road, if you like. So that's an important concept and one we need to everybody to understand. So in terms of the numbers, because I'm sure there's questions about what are the numbers, it isn't possible to directly compare previous consent with what we're now proposing in terms of just a single number, a 0.5 or a 1 or a 0.9 or something, because it depends on the unit mix. We're making sure that actually there's a higher parking ratio for larger units and a lower parking ratio for smaller units, which is in line with Welwyn Hatfield's own parking standards, which do the same. They have more cars for bigger units. So the unit mix, if the unit mix changes, then even if you had the same number of units, the ratio of parking would change as well. So you need to be careful we're not comparing apples with oranges there. Nevertheless, the principle is that the 2019 consent had across the piece an average of around about 0.7 cars per household, some of which were allocated specifically to residents, extra parking provided for visitors, and of course the spaces designated for the car club vehicles. Last year there was an application which some of the residents will have seen where we looked to reduce that level down, and it came down sort of almost to about 0.5, which the county council said that they thought was appropriate, but clearly the local residents thought was going too low. So now that's been pushed back up again, and when you consider phases 1, 2 and 3 together, it's up at about 0.66 at the moment, so pushing closer to the extant consent. Bearing in mind, of course, that phase 2 will be a detailed application and phase 3 outlined, so actually it may well be there's slightly more in phase 3. So we've got designated parking for residents, we've got extra parking for visitors, and we've got the car club vehicles. And the car club vehicles will be not only available to the residents on the scheme, they all get free membership as part of being a resident, but the car club vehicles will also be available to the wider community. And all the studies from Como UK, who are the charity that sort of look at all the car clubs around the country, all of their studies actually show that enables those one-car households to consider whether they need to own a car, and households that would otherwise be two-car households who only really use 1.1 can actually do away with a second car. They still own a car because they commute into Hatfield on a daily basis or whatever it might be. But the second car that would generally spend a lot of its time on the driveway, that's where they would use the car club vehicle. And the benefit of having a car club membership rather than just having a second car is there'll be a mix of cars. So it may well be you only need a little smart car, or it may well be you need a people carrier, or it may well be you need a van, or it may well be you need, and all of those vehicles and electric vehicles will be available as part of the car club across the entire site. So those hopefully are the numbers and the principles, but I'm happy if there's any other questions that have popped up while I've been speaking to see if I can answer them.
I think, I mean, there is, I think it's fair to say a skepticism. I was going to say cynicism, a skepticism that people, might even have 2 to 3 cars per property. But I mean, I was just thinking, Adam, for you as Metropolitan, whilst you are providing affordable housing, you're also selling houses here, and you must believe this to be a viable way to sell properties to provide the parking levels that you are. So you must have experience as Metropolitan Thames Valley that this parking level is appropriate. So maybe if we touch on this tonight, I was just thinking this through as we're speaking, but it might be at the consultation events on for tomorrow and Saturday. We just have that, your Metropolitan knowledge that shows actually this is appropriate, not just in inner London, but in Hertfordshire and other areas outside the capital, that this level of parking works for you as someone ultimately has to sell homes and make them desirable to people.
Yeah, I think just to be clear on that, Nick, of course, you're right to some extent, but just to be clear for the listeners, the sale element of these homes that we're talking about is obviously shared ownership, so it's still
of course. Sorry,
but you're right in that, people obviously, need to be committed to that to be able to make the sort of commitment to actually purchase their share of the home. I think certainly it's right, and I think just to add, Richard might want to jump in at points when I mentioned this. I mean, from the outset, of course, it's going to be clear that there's a choice for people here. We're not going to be having, it's going to be clear that people will have access to a car parking space, or they may not have access to a car parking space at the outset of when they move in. And I can't think of any circumstances where that's going to be taken away, of course, mid-occupation. So there's a choice here. So in terms of people with 3 cars, I'd highly suggest that they would probably not come and live in these homes, and they would have a choice to do that. So choice is a really big word here. The other element of it is just going back to what I mentioned earlier, is that we'd be the long-term landlord of this site. We're a housing association. That's how we operate. We'll manage the site as well. And as Richard, I think, touched on, of course, we've got a car parking management plan there, which incorporates all the elements which Richard mentioned. So there's a management regime here in terms of perhaps the stick of it. There's the carrot element of it in relation to all the items that Richard spoke about in terms of perhaps people not needing a car. And of course, there's always that element of choice. If you need to have 2 or 3 cars, then perhaps this is not quite the site for you. Equally, as you've kind of touched on there, Nick, we think there's a market here in terms of people that need these homes. I mean, we know that there's obviously an affordable housing need here in Welwyn Hatfield. And we believe that, of course, there's within that, residents that will be living in these homes, of course. So yes, in short, we're confident as an organisation that this works. We think there's the carrot to encourage people to be able to live in an area like this with access to cars, but perhaps not access to a number of private vehicles that they own. And then we've got the management element of it as well. Sorry, Richard.
No, just picking up very, very briefly what I didn't say. I referred to the previous consent on the site and the level of parking that was approved at that time. What I didn't say was the amount of work that went into establishing the correct level in the first place. And that actually, in addition to Metropolitan's knowledge of vehicle ownership for their own occupiers, there was also a lot of work done on census data for Pear Tree Ward and for Welwyn Hatfield as a whole, but also we liaised with the County Council, who had data on increases in the county over time and how that changed in certain towns in order to project forward to the future and predicted vehicle ownership levels, for household types, number of people per household. So it was a very in-depth study before we settled on these numbers. They weren't plucked out of nowhere. So we started with census. We spoke to the county council as the highway authority with their detailed knowledge of the county and the individual towns' car ownership levels, household types, and obviously we liaised very closely with MTVH on their knowledge of this type of product and who lives here, and from that's where we defined the level of car parking. We then added to that with the visitor parking and the car club vehicles, as well as the package. The car park management plan, by the way, had already been submitted to discharge conditions for phase 1 and signed off by the planning authority, and that looks in detail at how it's going to be managed, how the information is given to the residents before they move in,
Yep.
How that's managed over time on site, and obviously the highway authority had to be satisfied off site as well. So there's a great deal of information in there, and all of that submitted with the planning application. All that is transparent and there for public scrutiny.
Brilliant, thank you.